true democracy should not be defined by a handful of countries. China's permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva told the 48th session of the UN Human Rights Council on Monday on behalf of a group of like-minded countries. Why are these countries highlighting this message now? Are there any set models of human rights or democracy? How to look at China's efforts to promote development of human rights? I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Professor Zhengxin at China University of Political Science and Law, again by Blackburn-Dwyer joining us from Philadelphia, and Professor Peverelli of the Vrije University, Amsterdam, from Delft, the Netherlands. Gentlemen, welcome to the point. Professor Peverelli is affiliated, by the way, with a cross-cultural human rights center at the university. The warmest welcome to you for being here for the first time. So Ambassador Chen Xu in Geneva said true democracy should not be defined by a handful of countries. He had actually a lot more to say. Let's take a listen.
We are concerned about double or even multiple standards that are applied to democracy, by which democracy is used as a tool to impose one's value and political model on others. To contain others and interfere in their internal affairs under the pretext of democracy is the very opposite of democracy and will only bring chaos and turmoil and undermine the fundamental interests of people concerned around the world.
Ambassador Chen was speaking on behalf of countries such as Russia, Iran, Venezuela, DPRK, Myanmar, and etc. Professor Huo, why are these countries highlighting these messages at this moment?
Because, you know, nowadays the United States and some of its allies is using the issue of human rights to interfere the domestic affairs of other countries. So I think at this moment it is very important and necessary for China and some of its so-called mind-like countries to deliver this document, to speak in one voice, to demonstrate their point of view.
Professor Peverelli, what should be really the gauge, or who should have the final say as to whether a country has protected human rights well or not?
I think here is the problem here is that, especially in the Western, the American and the general Western point of view, is that they mistake a document that has been written in, was it 1948, and that is now placed in a vault somewhere in New York, with the rights that you have when you are born in the world as a human. And these are very, very different things. So what we study at the Cross-Cultural Human Rights Institute is actually the latter. And we believe that different sets of basic cultural values, and almost every nation has its own basic set of human values, and we can measure those values. We have developed a model in our institute. So there are actually theoretically as many different versions of human rights as there are nations in the world.
So who really...
Western nations are doing is to take this document. Yes, sorry, go on.
Yeah, who should really have the say? How do you judge whether a country has done well or not in terms of protecting human rights?
Yeah, the problem is that the only way that we have now, that is applied now, is to take that piece of paper or copies of it and then measure, ticking in the boxes, which leads actually to a large stream of accusations of all kinds of nations that they are violating human rights, but actually they may not be violating human rights, but they're violating, or they seem to be violating, a number of the clauses in that so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What's happening now is that many nations that are existing today, including in China, the People's Republic of China that is, did not exist when that document was written. Russia, another big nation, was called Soviet Union, and it's a very different nation. And there's now quite a number of nations in Southwest Asia and Africa did not exist, were not independent states, but they were colonies of European nations.
So what are the implications? So help us, because time is very limited. What are the implications of that factor in terms of the kind of disputes we're having about human rights, the kind of quarrel we're having all the time? Professor Peverelli.
Yeah, we should stop quarreling. Actually, nations should come together, and we have the so-called United Nations, and United Nations should really unite and get together and discuss a new vision on human rights, including a new vision, a new process of judging whether a certain region, nation is violating all human rights or not.
Okay. Brandon, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to separate democracy and human rights. The speech that I think had a lot of interesting pieces to it, we should note that it was on behalf of countries like the DPRK, Iran, and Myanmar, 3 countries that effectively do not have democracy by almost any modern definition. But if we're going to focus on human rights, my colleague is correct that modern day measures of human rights do stem from the 1947-1948 Universal Human Rights Declaration. But the problem is a lot of countries ask how we measure it. So China, I think, for example, has done an historically amazing job at raising a huge chunk of their citizenry out of poverty. It has actually contributed to a massive decrease in the amount of poverty globally simply through China's actions. That said, poverty is not the only measure of human rights. There are other areas that international bodies, U.S., the Western media, Southern countries as a whole would be very concerned about, saying that it's not simply about dollars and cents. There are other elements to human rights that are very concerning. And when countries sort of blanketly blame the United States or the West or the mainstream media or the UN for raising these issues, I think we need to look into it and say, look, there's a lot here. There is good here. How can we work on this? How can we broaden access to the best possible lives of the most amount of people around the world, even if that isn't through democracy? Is it through other items? Is it through improving rule of law and the like?
Okay, Professor Huo, what are your reactions to these also very interesting points?
Well, I should say that it is very difficult to say precisely who has the say to evaluate the human rights issues in one particular country. But I think undoubtedly the other countries, foreign countries, cannot unilaterally allege that the situation is not good. But it depends. I think the ideal situation depends on a multilateral arrangement. So the United Nations, the UN Security Councils, such authoritative international organizations should have a say instead of one particular country.
Well, the reason why I asked this question, for instance, because there is a very high level of satisfaction of the Chinese people towards their political system, towards the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and that is well documented, not just by Chinese polls, but by polls such as organized by Harvard University, for instance, over many years, over a decade, the Chinese citizens were satisfactory. Does that say something about how people feel, whether their rights have been protected or not, Professor Peverelli? And especially when you talk about each country having a different set of understanding or barometer about human rights, given what we have, shouldn't that be considered one way to say, okay, maybe China has done a reasonably good job?
Yes, well, in my terms, I would say China, the Chinese organization of society as a whole, and every aspect of it is a good cultural fit, in the sense that, as you said, an overwhelming part of the population is obviously, and I've been in China a lot of time, even in very recently. I was very happy to spend 3 months in China actually this year, enjoying actually the freedom of a COVID-19 free society, but that's another thing. So there is a real cultural fit. So the problem is, again, the problem with all the accusations going around is that we really need a completely new vision on human rights based on a cultural theory, on based of cultural values. And we have a United Nations, and it has a Human Rights Council. Let's use that council not to throw around accusations, but let's use that council to have a whole new discussion and a whole new definition supported by all the United Nations, instead of taking this piece of paper that has been signed a very long time before all of us were born. It's not that difficult a job to do, but no one is proposing it for some reason.
Maybe after we mention this on our show, maybe some discussion will be started. And I do think it is an interesting concept, because that paper was written many years ago. And certain countries, certain grouping of countries, let's say the EU, in their human rights charter, they actually specifically say they only enshrine certain rights in their Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is political rights, political and social rights, and they're not talking about economic rights or right to right against poverty or right to medical care and all of that. Brendan, how do you look at that?
I look at it as every country is free to sort of define itself, but I think when we're looking at from the outside looking in, which I think is really important in human rights, because of this, measurements of human rights should focus more on the plight and circumstances of the minority of a nation, not the majority. If you poll the majority of a country and they are the majority ruling party or they are the majority ruling group or ethnicity, they're going to usually say life is pretty good for us. So human rights, if we're really going to assess it, we have to look at
but
the minority.
I know you're
And that's
talking
true
about
in Western
Xinjiang
countries,
here.
that occurs
I know
in
you're
Asia,
talking about
and that's true
Xinjiang
across the
here.
world.
But the people of Xinjiang, if you go there, they're by and large very happy. Both the life expectancy and the population of Uyghur population has grown tremendously. So you cannot really say that here in China there is a majority of people who are happy, but a very small majority of particular ethnic groups are extremely unhappy. I'm going to give the last 20 seconds to Brendan because I said this. I want to give you a chance to react. 20 seconds, really.
I think that there's a lot to unpack with the Xinjiang, but I will stand by that, again, whether it's the United States, China, or Europe, or Africa, and the African nations, that the minority is usually where we need to look at to see. In the United States, we see many mistreated minorities. In the East Asia, we see the same. So whether it's Xinjiang or other specific case examples, this is the group that we should be looking at. Where are we seeing the broadest impact of human rights within countries?
Very interesting points all in all, but time is very limited. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Zhengxin joining us from Beijing, Brandon joining us from Philadelphia, and Professor Peverelli joining us from Delft, the Netherlands.